You're suspended, Tessa. Effective immediately!
For buying an elderly woman a loaf of bread?
For interfering in a customer transaction and ignoring your role. You're a janitor, not a manager. People like you create problems when they forget their place. Remember your place. Collect your final payment on Saturday.
That morning, Tessa Delaney spent her last $3 to protect an elderly stranger from being humiliated at the Brook Lane Market checkout. The woman had forgotten her wallet, the waiting customers had turned impatient, and Gordon Pike cared more about procedure than dignity. Tessa asked for nothing in return. She bought the bread, quietly returned to work, and expected the moment to disappear. Instead, Gordon treated compassion as insubordination. He took away the paycheck Tessa depended on for rent, groceries, and her mother's medicine, convinced that a janitor was too powerless to matter. But the elderly woman left carrying more than a loaf of bread. She carried Tessa's name and the memory of Gordon's cruelty. Gordon believed he had protected his authority. He had no idea how much that decision was about to cost him. If stories like this one stay with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week we share true-to-life stories about ordinary people who chose to do the right thing and what happened next. Now let's go back to the beginning. The morning had started the way most of Tessa Delaney's mornings did, quietly, without complaint. She'd been at Brook Lane Market since 6, running a mop across floors that never seemed to stay clean, restocking the cleaning supplies closet before the first wave of shoppers arrived. It was the kind of work that made you invisible, and Tessa had learned to be okay with that. After 2 years of cover letters and interviews that led nowhere, she'd stopped waiting for a different life and started showing up for the one she had. She had a business degree from a state university and a resume that looked fine on paper. But fine on paper had never been enough to get a call back from the companies she'd applied to, and after a while the silence started to feel like an answer. So she took the job at Brook Lane because the rent was due, and her mother's prescriptions weren't free, and because sometimes the only thing you can do is keep moving. She didn't complain about the uniform or the hours. She didn't roll her eyes when managers spoke to her like she couldn't understand full sentences. She just kept the floors clean and reminded herself that this wasn't the whole story, only a chapter. Her mother Maribel had been sick for 3 years. Nothing catastrophic, but nothing simple, either the kind of illness that required consistent medication and regular checkups, the kind that added up slowly until you were doing math in your head every time you stood at a pharmacy counter. Tessa's paycheck covered rent, groceries, and exactly enough of Maribel's prescriptions to keep things stable. There was never anything left over. That was just the shape of their life, and both of them had learned to move within it without making it heavier than it already was. Maribel never complained about what they didn't have. She made dinner with whatever was in the kitchen, kept a library book on the nightstand, and told Tessa every evening that things had a way of finding their shape. Tessa believed her mostly. On the harder evenings, she believed her a little less, but she never said so. She understood something most people in comfortable positions never had to learn, that dignity was a luxury a lot of people couldn't afford, and that the absence of it left a mark. She'd felt it herself in waiting rooms where receptionists looked through her in job interviews, where someone's expression shifted the moment they glanced at her address in stores, where her uniform made her effectively invisible unless she was in someone's way. She didn't carry that hurt like a wound. She carried it like a compass, using it to remind herself how she wanted to treat the people she encountered every day. Gordon Pike managed the store the way certain people manage anything they've been given authority over, with a tight grip and very little imagination. He was not a cruel man in the dramatic sense, but he was a precise one, and precision without empathy tends to land the same way. He cared about procedure. He cared about the store's image, its numbers, its orderly appearance. He did not particularly care about the people working inside it, so long as they were performing their functions without incident. Tessa had learned to work around him. She kept her head down, completed her tasks, and stayed out of conversations he was involved in. It had worked for almost a year. It stopped working on a Tuesday. Lucille Harrow arrived at Brook Lane Market just before 10 in the morning, moving slowly through the produce section with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. She was in her mid-70s, dressed simply carrying a canvas bag over one arm. She selected a loaf of bread, a small carton of soup, and a few other items, then made her way to the checkout line. It was only when the cashier announced her total that Lucille reached into her bag and discovered her wallet was not there. She searched twice methodically, the way people do when they're certain they've made an error and are trying to locate exactly where. The wallet was at home on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker. She was sure of it. She explained this calmly to the cashier, a young man named Ryan, who was not unkind but was also not sure what to do. She asked if she could set her items aside, step outside to call someone, and return within the hour. It was a reasonable request. The problem was the line behind her, which had grown to 5 or 6 people, some of whom had places to be, and limited patience for delays. A man in a gray jacket made a comment under his breath. A woman near the back said something about people who came to the store without a plan to actually pay. Lucille kept her composure, but her hands had started to tremble slightly, the way hands do when you're older, and you've been standing for a while, and the situation around you has become unkind. Gordon appeared from the direction of his office. He assessed the scene in about 4 seconds, the backed-up line, the old woman with no wallet, the disruption to the flow of his store, and made a decision. He told Lucille politely, but with no room for negotiation, that she would need to return the items and come back when she was prepared to complete her purchase. When Lucille tried to explain again that she only needed a few minutes, that someone could bring her wallet, Gordon told her he would have to ask security to assist her out if she couldn't move along. He said it quietly, but he said it in front of everyone. Tessa had been refilling paper towel dispensers at the end of the aisle. She heard all of it. She stood there for a moment, watching a woman in her 70s being told she was a disruption. Watching her try to hold herself together in front of a line of strangers who were already forming opinions about her. Tessa knew that feeling, not the specific circumstance, but the specific kind of shame it produced, the way it settled into your chest when a room full of people decided you were the problem. She reached into her pocket. She had $3 and some change, which was all that was left until the end of the week. She walked to the register and put it down. She told Ryan it should be enough to cover the bread. It was. She slid the rest of her items back to Lucille and said she hoped the rest of her day went better. Then she went back to her paper towel dispensers. Lucille caught up with her near the cleaning supplies aisle. The older woman asked why she'd done it. Why spend money on a stranger when she clearly wasn't carrying much herself? Tessa thought about it for a second, then said that nobody should be made to feel that small over a mistake that small. That she knew what it felt like, and she didn't want to watch it happen to someone else if she could do something about it. Lucille looked at her for a long moment, then thanked her by name, reading it off her badge, and walked toward the exit. Gordon called Tessa into his office before Lucille's car had left the parking lot. He was already seated behind his desk when she came in, and he had the particular expression of someone who had decided on an outcome before the conversation started. He told her that what she'd done was a violation of store protocol, that she had interfered in a customer transaction, contributed to a disruption in the checkout line, and acted outside her role as a janitorial employee. Tessa listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she said she had purchased a loaf of bread. That was all. A woman had forgotten her wallet. People had been rude to her, and Tessa had bought her a loaf of bread. Gordon said that wasn't the point. The point was that she had inserted herself into a situation that wasn't hers to resolve. He told her she was suspended, effective immediately, pending further review, that he made clear would not resolve in her favor. Tessa asked him to reconsider. She said it plainly, without drama, that her mother needed medication, that she needed the paycheck at the end of the week, that this job was the only thing keeping their household functional. Gordon told her she could collect her final payment on Saturday, and that she should use the time to reflect on the importance of following procedure. He said it the way people say things they've already stopped thinking about. Tessa left the office, walked to her locker, put on her coat, and drove home in a car that needed new brake pads. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Maribel came out of her room when she heard the door, saw Tessa's face, and sat down across from her without asking anything. That was the thing about her mother. She never filled silence with noise when silence was what was needed. After a while, Tessa told her what had happened. Maribel listened, then reached across the table and put her hand over Tessa's. She said that what Tessa had done was right. She said she didn't want to be kept alive by a daughter who had learned to walk past people who needed help. Tessa looked at her for a moment, then nodded. They sat there together until the room got dark, and one of them got up to turn on the light. What Tessa didn't know was that Lucille Harrow had arrived home, sat down at her own kitchen table, and told her daughter everything. Corrine Harrow had built Harrow-Crest Holdings over 20 years into one of the most influential private corporations in the country. She was not a sentimental person. By nature, she had learned early that sentiment without action was just decoration. But when her mother described standing at a checkout counter while a store manager threatened to call security, and then described a young woman in a janitor's uniform who had reached into her own pocket, Corrine felt something tighten in her chest that she recognized as anger. Clean, focused anger. The kind that had a direction. She said she would handle it. Lucille said she didn't want it handled not the way Corrine usually handled things, which tended to involve lawyers, or large sums of money, or both. Lucille said the girl hadn't done it for a reward. She'd done it because it was right. And she wanted Corrine to think carefully about what that meant before she did anything at all. They drove to the address on Tessa's employee file the following morning. Tessa answered the door in yesterday's clothes, holding a cup of coffee she'd already reheated twice. She looked at the two women on her doorstep, one she recognized from the store, one she didn't, and waited. Corrine introduced herself without title or company name, just her full name, and said she wanted to talk. Tessa let them in because Lucille was there, and she trusted Lucille in the way you trust someone who has already seen you at your most unguarded and treated you gently anyway. They sat at the same table where Tessa and Maribel had sat the night before. Corrine asked questions not about the bread, but about Tessa herself, her degree, what she'd studied, why she hadn't found work in her field. Tessa answered honestly without performing humility or bitterness, just describing the sequence of events as it had actually happened. 2 years of interviews, 100 applications, a market that didn't have room for someone without connections or credentials from the right institutions, no matter what her transcript said. Corrine told her about Harrow-Crest Holdings. She told her about a leadership development program the company ran for a small number of people each year, people they believed had the capacity to grow into significant roles if given the right environment. She said she wanted Tessa in that program. She said it directly without framing it as charity or favor, because Corrine Harrow did not offer things she didn't mean. Tessa sat with that for a long moment. She thought about everything it would cost her to say yes, the gap in experience, the rooms full of people with better schools and better networks, the very specific way she would be looked at the moment anyone learned where she'd come from. She thought about what it would cost her to say no, which was harder and quieter and stretched further into the future. Then she said she would do it. She said she would work hard enough to make sure Corrine didn't regret the decision. She said it not as a performance of gratitude, but as a statement of intent, the only kind of promise Tessa had ever known how to make. Lucille smiled at her from across the table. Tessa recognized it as the same expression the older woman had worn in the store right before she'd said thank you, and walked away as though she'd already known something Tessa was only just beginning to understand. The Harrow-Crest Holdings offices occupied the top 6 floors of a glass building downtown, and on the morning Tessa walked through the lobby for the first time, as a program participant, she understood immediately that she was going to have to get used to being looked at. Not in the way she'd been looked at Brook Lane, where people looked through her. Here they looked directly at her, with the particular curiosity of people trying to figure out why she was there. She signed in at the front desk, was given a badge and a welcome folder, and was escorted to the conference room where the rest of the leadership development cohort had already gathered. She counted 11 other people. She was the last to arrive. The others had the easy confidence of people who had spent their lives in rooms like this one. Most of them had come from graduate programs at schools with names everyone recognized. Several had already completed stints at companies that made the financial press on a regular basis. One of them, a man named Carter, had done his undergraduate thesis on a restructuring strategy that was apparently still taught in 2 business schools on the East Coast. Tessa had a state university degree and 2 years of mopping floors, and she was aware that everyone in the room had already heard some version of her story by the time she sat down. The whispers started before lunch. She caught fragments of them, someone saying her name, someone else saying the phrase, "Corrine's charity project," someone laughing quietly in response. She didn't react. She had grown up learning not to hand people the satisfaction of a visible wound. And that skill served her now the way it always had. She took notes, asked questions during the first session, and introduced herself to the 2 people sitting closest to her with the same directness she used for everything else. One of them, a woman named Diane, shook her hand warmly and slid her a pen when Tessa's ran dry. The other looked at his phone. By the end of the first week, 3 members of the cohort had filed informal complaints with the Human Resources Department, suggesting that Tessa's inclusion represented a conflict of interest on Corrine's part, that the CEO had used her position to favor someone without the qualifications to compete fairly. The HR director brought it to Corrine's attention, who scheduled a meeting with the full group within 48 hours. Diane, who had overheard the conversation in the corridor, found Tessa in the break room that same evening and told her directly, staying long enough to make sure Tessa had her number in case she needed anything before the meeting. Corrine addressed the room without a prepared statement, standing at the head of the table, with her arms at her sides and her voice at its usual register, measured clear and entirely certain of itself. She acknowledged that the complaints had been made and said she would address them directly rather than through procedural language. She told the group that Tessa had not been selected out of gratitude for a personal kindness. She had been selected because she had demonstrated in a low-stakes moment, with no audience and no incentive, the precise qualities that Harrow-Crest Holdings claimed to value in its leaders: integrity, empathy, and the willingness to act on a correct judgment, even when the cost was real. Corrine said that credentials were easy to evaluate, and character was not, and that she had chosen to prioritize the harder measurement. Then she said the matter was closed and moved on to the agenda. It helped. The room shifted slightly, not toward warmth, but toward something more neutral. What Tessa understood, though, was that Corrine's defense was a door she had opened, not a floor she could stand on forever. The protection would last exactly as long as Tessa's results supported it. After that, she was on her own, the same as everyone else. So she worked. She stayed late on evenings when the others had gone to dinner. She read the materials twice, sometimes 3 times, because reading them once gave her the information, and reading them again gave her the context she hadn't developed through years of working inside rooms like this one. She was slower than the others at some things: the financial modeling software, the internal reporting templates, the particular shorthand that people used when they'd been speaking the same professional language for a decade. She was faster at other things which she noticed quietly and did not advertise. The first real test came 6 weeks in during a project review for one of the company's regional distribution operations. The team had been tasked with identifying inefficiencies and proposing a corrective plan. The other participants built their proposals from the data available in the company's internal reporting system. Solid work, thorough, defensible. Tessa did that too, but she also spent 2 evenings talking to the warehouse coordinators and night shift supervisors whose daily experience never made it into any report. They had been processing the same broken workflow for 3 years. They knew exactly where it was breaking and why. The pattern she found wasn't in the data. It was in the gap between the data and the daily reality of the people doing the actual work. Her proposal identified a structural communication gap that none of the other presentations had addressed, and she included specific recommendations from the floor-level staff alongside her own analysis. The regional director who reviewed the submissions told Corrine privately that it was the most operationally grounded proposal he'd seen from a development cohort participant in 4 years. Word moved through the office the way word always does. The whispers didn't disappear, but they changed in character. Tessa noticed that Spencer Reddick, a senior manager who had been with the company for 8 years, had started paying a different kind of attention to her work. Not curious attention. Watchful attention, the kind that calculated rather than observed. Spencer was good at his job. He was organized, politically skilled, and well-liked by the leadership team in the particular way of someone who had spent years learning how to be useful to the people above him. He had expected reasonably that the next significant opportunity at Harrow-Crest would be his. He had put in the years and the late nights and the careful relationship building that such expectations required. He had a plan for his own future inside this company, and that plan did not include being outpaced by someone who had arrived with a janitor's badge and a borrowed suit. 6 months after Tessa joined the program, Corrine called her into her office and told her she was being appointed project director for the Langley Civic Trust proposal. Tessa had heard about Langley, everyone in the building had. It was a community development initiative that, if it moved forward, would represent one of the largest public-private partnerships in the region's history. The projected investment ran into the billions. The scope covered housing infrastructure, education, and healthcare across dozens of low-income neighborhoods. Several senior leaders had made clear in various meetings that it was too important and too complex to be managed by someone still technically in a development program. Corrine heard those objections and appointed Tessa anyway. The pushback was immediate. 2 vice presidents requested a formal meeting. A third sent a memo outlining the reputational risk. Corrine acknowledged each of them and did not change her decision. Tessa received the project files on a Thursday morning and spent the weekend reading every page of them, including the appendices that most people skipped. What the files described was a conventional development model, new construction, upgraded facilities, improved infrastructure. All of it well-intentioned, all of it designed from the outside in. Tessa read it twice and felt something she couldn't immediately name, not skepticism exactly, more like a question she needed to answer before she could move forward. She requested 2 weeks before the proposal work began in earnest. She spent those 2 weeks in the neighborhoods the project was designed to serve. She sat in living rooms and community center meeting halls. She talked to a middle school teacher who had been managing a leaking classroom ceiling for 3 years and who had very specific ideas about what her students actually needed. She talked to a nurse practitioner running a community clinic out of a converted storage unit because the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away without traffic. She talked to the owner of a hardware store who had watched 4 neighboring businesses close in the past 2 years and who understood exactly why. What they told her was consistent. They didn't need to be developed. They needed to be included. They needed to be partners, not beneficiaries. Tessa went back to her desk and rewrote the entire proposal framework. The new plan centered local residents as active participants rather than passive recipients. It proposed a governance structure that gave community members a formal seat in the design and oversight process. It allocated a significant portion of the budget toward vocational training programs, small business grants, and educational scholarships. Investments that would generate economic activity from within, rather than importing it from outside. The construction components were still there, but they were now the scaffolding rather than the substance. When she presented the revised framework to the internal steering committee, the head of the development division said it was ambitious in the tone people use when they mean risky. Tessa said that ambitious and risky weren't the same thing, and that the original framework, while safer to pitch internally, was less likely to generate the long-term community investment that would make the project actually work. The Langley Civic Trust representatives, when she shared the revised approach in a preliminary call, responded with an enthusiasm the internal team hadn't expected. Spencer said nothing in these meetings. He listened, nodded occasionally, and took notes in a small leather notebook he carried everywhere. After the Langley call, he told Tessa in the corridor that the new framework was impressive. She returned the compliment because there was nothing else to do with it yet. The full presentation to the Langley Civic Trust Board was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Tessa spent the 3 days before it reviewing every figure in the proposal, walking through the slides, with Diane checking and rechecking the financial projections that Spencer's team had contributed to the package. Everything looked right. She arrived 20 minutes early, set up the presentation, and stood at the front of the room as the board members filed in. She was 4 slides in when she noticed it. The numbers on her screen didn't match the numbers in the printed document she was holding. The cost projections were different, higher, and differently distributed in a way that made two of the budget categories look inconsistent. She moved to the next slide. The revenue modeling was off too, in a direction from that undermined the long-term viability argument she had spent weeks building. She kept her face still and her voice steady, and she reached the end of that slide without letting anyone in the room see the calculation running inside her. How bad is this? How far does it go? And what am I going to do about it right now? She had two options. She could continue and hope the board didn't catch the inconsistency, protect the presentation, protect the momentum, and deal with the numbers afterward. Or she could stop. Tessa set down her presenter remote and told the room that she needed to stop. She said it clearly, without prelude. She told the board that the figures currently displayed did not match the documents she had reviewed and approved, and that she was not willing to continue until she understood the discrepancy. She apologized for the interruption, said that Harrow-Crest Holdings would conduct an immediate internal review, and committed to full transparency about whatever the investigation found. She said that if the error originated with her team, she would own it. Then she gathered her materials and walked out of the building. She sat in her car and stared at the steering wheel, aware that she had just made a decision she couldn't undo. In 8 years of working with large corporations, the Langley board had rarely seen anyone stop their own presentation to protect accuracy over optics. That information was still on its way to her. Right now, all she had was the certainty that someone inside Harrow-Crest had changed her numbers, and the understanding that she would have to find out who. The internal investigation took 4 days. Corrine assigned it to the company's head of security and legal counsel, working together with access to the full system log of everyone who had touched the Langley proposal files in the 72 hours before the presentation. Tessa was asked to provide her original approved documents, which she submitted immediately, and then she was told to continue her regular work while the review proceeded. That was the hardest part, sitting at her desk, responding to emails, attending a Thursday afternoon strategy session, as though the ground beneath her wasn't uncertain. The result came back on a Monday. Spencer Reddick had accessed her files remotely on the evening before the presentation, using a backdoor in the project management system that he'd discovered months earlier and never reported. He had altered the cost projections and the revenue modeling in ways that were subtle enough to survive a casual review, but damaging enough to collapse the proposal's credibility under scrutiny. The digital trail was clear and complete. Corrine informed Tessa of the findings before they were shared more broadly. She laid out the facts without editorializing, then asked Tessa how she wanted to proceed with her awareness of them. Tessa said she needed a few minutes with Spencer before anything else happened. Corrine looked at her for a moment, then nodded and made a call. Spencer was in a small conference room on the 4th floor when Tessa arrived. He looked like someone who had spent 4 days not sleeping, which she suspected was accurate. He didn't say anything when she came in. She sat down across from him and set a paper bag on the table between them, a sandwich and a coffee from the cart in the lobby, because she'd noticed on her way through that he was there alone with nothing, and something in her had responded to that before her mind had caught up to it. Spencer looked at the bag, then at her. He asked what she was doing. Tessa said she'd noticed he hadn't eaten, which was a thing she tended to notice about people. His jaw tightened. He told her she should be furious. She said she was, and that it didn't change the fact that he looked like he hadn't had a meal since Friday. What came out of him after that was less a confession than an exhaustion, the kind that happens when someone has been carrying something heavy for so long that setting it down feels the same as collapsing. He talked about the 8 years he'd given to Harrow-Crest, the projects he'd built, the relationships he'd maintained, the careful and disciplined way he'd positioned himself for the next level. He said he'd genuinely believed that he was next, that all the time he'd spent the evenings away from his family, the weekends answering emails, the years of making himself indispensable, had been building towards something specific. Then Tessa had walked in with no history in the company, no industry network, nothing but a story about a grocery store. And within 6 months, she was running the most significant project in the division's recent memory. He said it wasn't fair. He said he knew how that sounded. Tessa listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said she understood why he felt that way, and she wasn't going to tell him he was wrong to feel it, because she wasn't sure he was. What she was sure about was that none of what he felt had required him to destroy a project, that 3 years of planning had gone into a project designed to build schools and clinics and economic opportunity in neighborhoods that had been waiting for someone to take them seriously. She said the families she'd sat with in those living rooms hadn't done anything to him. Spencer looked at the table. He didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't one. Tessa told him she wasn't going to pretend this conversation erased what he'd done. The investigation would reach its conclusion regardless of what happened in this room. What she'd wanted, the only thing she'd wanted, was to understand whether the person who had made that choice was the whole of who he was or just the worst version of himself in a moment when he'd let fear make the decision. Spencer didn't answer that either, but his eyes went glassy in a way that was itself a kind of answer. Tessa pushed the paper bag slightly closer to him and left the room. Spencer was formally terminated by the end of that week. The announcement to the company was brief and procedural. No one who knew what had happened was surprised. Tessa went back to her desk and sent the Langley Civic Trust a request for the follow-up meeting that board chair Walter Briggs had offered her. He confirmed within the hour. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Tessa walked the board through the complete corrected proposal. Every figure, every projection, every structural element of the revised framework, including the community governance model and the investment allocations she'd built from her 2 weeks in the neighborhoods. She answered every question directly and acknowledged every uncertainty rather than smoothing over it. Walter Briggs asked her at one point what she would do if the community partnership model turned out to be harder to implement than her timeline assumed. She said she would adjust the timeline, not the model, because the model was the reason the project was worth doing. He wrote something down. At the end of the meeting, the board voted to proceed. The partnership agreement was signed 3 weeks later. The Langley project moved through its phases over the following 18 months, with construction proceeding in parallel with the education and training programs. The middle school teacher got her classroom repaired and then got a seat on the education subcommittee. The nurse practitioner's clinic was folded into a new community health center that opened 14 months into the project. The hardware store owner ended up advising the small business support program. Community members rotated through the oversight committee in a process that Tessa's team had designed specifically so that participation didn't require people to take time off work they couldn't afford to miss. The neighborhoods hadn't been waiting for someone to build things for them. They'd been waiting for someone to build things with them. That distinction, small on paper, was enormous in practice. When the 18-month mark arrived, Corrine called Tessa into her office and told her she was creating a new division, Community Development and Social Impact. Its mandate would be to extend the model Tessa had built for Langley into Harrow-Crest's broader portfolio. Corrine said she wanted Tessa to run it with the title of director and a team she would build herself. Tessa asked whether this was connected to the Langley outcome or to what had happened before it. Corrine said it was connected to the entire arc, to the proposal she had rewritten, to the presentation she had stopped, to the way she had handled Spencer afterward, and to the results now visible in the neighborhoods where the project was operating. Tessa took the role. She built the team carefully, bringing in people whose knowledge of the communities they'd be serving came from direct experience rather than academic study. She established a fellowship that brought in 2 external participants each year from nonprofit and community organization backgrounds. She launched an internal scholarship fund for Harrow-Crest employees, hourly workers, and support staff who wanted to return to school, partnering with 3 community colleges to create a pathway that didn't require choosing between a paycheck and a degree. The program was quiet at first. By the end of its second year, 14 employees had enrolled. Diane, who had moved into a project management role within the division, ran the application review process with the kind of attention to detail she'd shown from the first week of the cohort. The house came about a year after the directorship. Lucille mentioned it first, a small property, not far from where Maribel had been living in a rented apartment. She and Corrine had arranged to purchase it and wanted to transfer the title to Tessa and her mother. Tessa said no immediately and then tried to find the right words to explain why. She said it was too much, that she hadn't helped Lucille at the grocery store as an investment, and she didn't want to accept something of that magnitude in return. It felt like it would change the nature of what that morning had been. Lucille listened to all of this, and then said that the $3 Tessa had spent hadn't been nothing, they had been everything she had invested in a stranger without any expectation of return. She said that she and Corrine understood exactly what that cost, and that they weren't offering the house out of sentimentality or obligation. They were investing in Tessa's stability, the same way Tessa had invested in Lucille's dignity, not because it was owed, but because it was the right thing to do with the resources they had. Tessa called Lucille the next morning and said yes. Maribel cried when she saw it. Not loudly, she wasn't a loud person, but in the quiet, sustained way of someone who had been holding something carefully for a very long time and had finally been told she could set it down. Tessa stood next to her in the front doorway and didn't say anything because nothing needed to be said. They'd done the math together for years. Now the math was different. That was enough. 5 years after the morning Tessa had walked into Harrow-Crest's lobby for the first time, Corrine called her into a meeting that turned out not to be a meeting. Lucille was there too, sitting in the chair by the window that she occupied whenever she visited, which was more frequently now that Corrine had begun stepping back from the daily demands of running the company. Corrine said she was transitioning to a board role. She said the company needed a CEO who understood what it was supposed to be doing in the world and had already demonstrated the capacity to move it in that direction. She said she wanted Tessa to take the position. Tessa's first response was that she wasn't ready. She said it honestly, not as a performance of modesty. She genuinely felt the weight of what was being asked. There was still a voice somewhere inside her that sounded like the person she had been before any of this, the woman who had memorized every exit in rooms she wasn't sure she was supposed to be in, who had spent years hearing silence where an answer should have been. That voice said she was too far from where she'd started, that someone would figure it out eventually. Lucille said that nobody was ready for the decisions that actually mattered. She said readiness was something you convinced yourself you had after the fact, looking back at the moments when you'd been terrified and had moved forward anyway. She said the question wasn't whether Tessa was afraid. The question was whether she was willing to keep going regardless. Tessa said yes. She said it with one condition, that she be permitted to continue spending time with the people in the company who were doing the work that no one else noticed. The administrative staff, the maintenance crews, the overnight security guards, the people whose names appeared on no organizational chart that anyone senior ever looked at. Corrine said that wasn't a condition. It was a given. And she was glad Tessa had said it out loud. On the morning of her first day as CEO, Tessa arrived early the way she always had. She was crossing the lobby when she noticed a young woman in a maintenance uniform pushing a cart of cleaning supplies toward the service elevator. Something in the woman's expression, alert and self-contained, pointed somewhere just past the present moment, was familiar in a way that didn't require explanation. Tessa walked over and introduced herself by name. She asked how long the woman had been with the company. Then she mentioned the employee scholarship program, and when the woman said she hadn't heard of it, Tessa described it and gave her the name of the HR contact who handled applications. The young woman looked at her the way people look when they're not sure what to do with unexpected information. Tessa recognized that look too. She said to take her time with it, that the program would still be there when she was ready, and then she went upstairs. On her desk in a small paper bag with a handwritten note from Lucille was a loaf of bread. It arrived every year on the anniversary of a Tuesday morning that had meant nothing to anyone watching and had changed everything for the people involved. Tessa set it on the corner of her desk, where she would see it all day. Then she opened her laptop and started to work. Tessa Delaney didn't change her life because she knew the right people or said the right things at the right moment. She changed it because she chose on an ordinary Tuesday morning with $3 in her pocket and nothing to gain to treat a stranger with the dignity she would have wanted for herself. That choice cost her a job. It also cost her nothing she couldn't live with. And that's perhaps the most important distinction this story leaves us with, the things we do when no one is watching and when there is no reward coming. Those are the things that tell us and the world exactly who we are. If this story stayed with you, we'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. Every week we bring you stories like this one, stories about ordinary people, quiet moments, and the choices that end up meaning everything. Hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next one.